The radio crackled with static across Fort Bragg's operations center at 3:47 hours, and Major General David Kessler felt his stomach drop. The voice that emerged wasn't one of his squadron leaders or tactical coordinators. It was calm, measured, and unmistakably feminine. Actual, this is Ironside. Single ship inbound 7 minutes out. Requesting priority clearance for emergency landing. I have wounded. The entire room went silent. Kessler's hand froze over the radio transmitter. Ironside. That call sign had been retired 3 years ago when Captain Nora Graves was medically grounded after a catastrophic engagement over the Hindu Kush. The records were clear. Permanent vestibular damage, chronic vertigo, deemed unfit for combat operations. Yet here was someone claiming that call sign, claiming to be flying an A-10 Thunderbolt II through contested airspace, alone, in the dead of night. Ironside, say again your last, Kessler transmitted, his voice tight. Confirm your tail number and current position. There was a pause then. Tail number 7739 Ereco. Grid November Sierra 4126. Major, I don't have time for verification protocols. I've got 2 Marines bleeding out in my gun bay and fuel for maybe 15 minutes. Clear the damn runway. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, standing beside Kessler, pulled up the asset tracking board. His face went pale. Sir, 7739 Ereco. That's the warthog we scrapped last month, stripped for parts at Davis-Monthan. Kessler's jaw clenched. Someone was either playing an elaborate hoax or something impossible was happening in the sky above North Carolina. He keyed the radio again. Ironside, you are not on any authorized flight manifest. Identify yourself immediately or you will be treated as hostile. The response came back sharp, edged with something that might have been anger or might have been pain. My name is Nora Graves, Major. I pulled 2 Marines out of a hot zone near the border 3 hours ago when your quick reaction force couldn't get airborne. I've been flying on fumes and instinct since then. Now you can either let me land this bird, or you can watch it crash with 3 Americans inside. Your call. Webb was already pulling up Graves' file. The photograph showed a woman with sharp cheekbones and darker skin, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much. Distinguished Flying Cross. Silver Star. 12 confirmed enemy armor kills in 1 sortie. Then the medical discharge, the quiet disappearance from service. The file was stamped permanently grounded in red letters. She shouldn't even be able to stand without losing balance, Webb muttered. How the hell is she flying? Kessler stared at the radar screen, watching the single green blip crawling toward them through the darkness. Outside Fort Bragg, the night sky held its breath. Somewhere in that darkness, an aircraft that shouldn't exist was being flown by a pilot who shouldn't be capable of flight. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog, was a beast of American close air support, a titanium bathtub wrapped around a 30mm rotary cannon, designed to survive hell and deliver it with equal measure. It was slow, ugly, and absolutely lethal. And right now, one was limping home with a ghost at the controls. Nora Graves had been 17 when she first saw an A-10 at an airshow in Nevada. While other kids gawked at the sleek F-16s and the thundering F-15s, she'd stood transfixed by the awkward, ungainly Warthog as it made its demonstration run. The sound of that GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a deep, resonant BRRRT that seemed to tear the sky itself, had reverberated in her chest. She'd known then, with the certainty that only teenagers possess, that she would fly that aircraft. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, had laughed. Baby girl, he'd said, that's a tank killer. You gotta be mean to fly mean. She'd spent the next decade proving she was mean enough. Naval Academy, flight school, countless hours in simulators and training flights. She'd graduated 3rd in her class and requested A-10s when everyone else was chasing the glamour of 5th-generation fighters. Her instructors had called her reckless. Her squadron mates had called her Ironside after her first combat deployment, when she'd taken a hit from a shoulder-fired missile that should have brought her down. She'd nursed the wounded Warthog back to base with half a wing shredded and hydraulics failing. landed it on a foam-covered runway, and walked away with nothing but a bruised ego and a new reputation. That was before the Hindu Kush, before the mission that ended her career and nearly ended her life, before the vertigo, the medical boards, and the slow, grinding realization that the thing she'd built her entire identity around was being taken away. The Air Force had tried to give her a desk job. She'd resigned instead. Some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed with paperwork and therapy. But tonight, something had pulled her back to the sky. The operations center at Fort Bragg erupted into controlled chaos. Kessler ordered the runway cleared and emergency crews staged. He had the tower light up every approach beacon they had. If this was really Nora Graves, if she really had wounded Marines aboard, then whatever impossible circumstances had put her in that cockpit could wait. Saving lives came first. Questions came second. "Ironside, you're cleared for emergency landing, runway 27, the tower controller transmitted. Winds 230 at 8 knots. Emergency vehicles are standing by." Nora's voice crackled back, steadier now. "Copy, tower, beginning final approach. And tower, tell the fire crews to stand ready. My landing gear indicator is dark. Don't know if the wheels are down or if I'm coming in on my belly." Webb swore under his breath. A belly landing in an A-10 was survivable, but with wounded personnel aboard and uncertain fuel status, it would be threading a needle through a hurricane. The Warthog could take punishment, but it wasn't magic. And neither, presumably, was Nora Graves, no matter what her file said about her flying. Kessler moved to the observation window. In the distance, he could see the glow of runway lights cutting through the darkness. Somewhere beyond them, that single aircraft was descending. He found himself thinking about all the impossible things he'd seen in 26 years of service. The improbable shots, the miraculous survivals, the moments when everything should have gone wrong but somehow didn't. The military bred skeptics, but it also bred believers. You had to believe in something when you sent people into harm's way. "Sir," Webb said quietly, "if it really is her, if she really flew a scrapped aircraft out of an unauthorized zone to extract personnel, we're looking at about 40 different violations. Court-martial territory." Kessler didn't take his eyes off the window. "Then we better make sure those Marines survive to testify." The A-10 emerged from the darkness like a ghost ship breaking through fog. Its silhouette was unmistakable. The high-mounted engines, the wide straight wings, the shark-mouth paint on the nose that some crews still applied despite regulations against it. This one's mouth was faded, barely visible, suggesting it had indeed been sitting in a boneyard before somehow returning to flight. The aircraft was trailing a thin line of smoke from the port engine, and it was flying lower and slower than normal approach speed. Dangerously slow. Nora was keeping it in the air through sheer will and whatever fuel remained in the tanks. The landing lights snapped on as she aligned with the runway, and every person in the operations center held their breath. The Warthog's nose lifted slightly. The tail dropped. She was flaring for landing, but without gear confirmation, nobody knew if she was about to set down on wheels or titanium belly. The moment stretched like taffy, time distorting the way it does when everything hangs in balance. The A-10's main gear kissed the runway with a screech of rubber that echoed across the base. The nose gear followed a heartbeat later, and suddenly the impossible aircraft was rolling, slowing, real and solid and undeniably present. Nora had her wheels down. She'd made it. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the Warthog as it rolled to a stop on the taxiway. Kessler was already moving, taking the stairs two at a time down from the operations center. He needed to see this with his own eyes, needed to understand how any of this was possible. By the time he reached the taxiway, the A-10's canopy was already rising. Nora Graves emerged slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing intense pain. Even in the harsh flood lights, Kessler could see she was sheet white, her flight suit soaked with sweat. She practically fell from the cockpit ladder, caught herself, and immediately turned to help the emergency crews access the gun bay where she'd somehow secured her passengers. Two Marines, both young, both bloodied, were extracted with practiced efficiency. One was unconscious, the other semi-alert and trying to talk. Paramedics loaded them onto stretchers and rushed them toward waiting ambulances. Nora watched until they were away, then her legs buckled. She went down hard on the tarmac, catching herself on one hand. A crew chief rushed forward to help, but she waved him off, fighting her way back to her feet through what was clearly overwhelming vertigo. When she finally looked up and saw Kessler approaching, something flickered in her expression. Not fear, not defiance, just bone-deep exhaustion. "Captain Graves," Kessler said, then corrected himself. "Ms. Graves." "Major," she replied, her voice hoarse. "I'd salute, but I'm fairly certain I'd fall over." "How did you?" He stopped, shook his head. "There are about 100 questions I need to ask you. And I've got answers for maybe half of them." She swayed slightly, caught herself again. "The Marines. They need to know about Sergeant Chen. He didn't make it out. I tried, but the LZ was too hot and he was too far from the extraction point. He told me to get the other two out, made me promise." Kessler felt something tighten in his chest. He'd lost people before, knew the weight of those names you carried. "We'll make sure his family knows what happened." Nora nodded, but her eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the floodlit tarmac. "I haven't flown in 3 years. Tonight I couldn't even drive to the grocery store without the world spinning, but I heard the radio traffic. Heard that patrol was pinned down and the QRF couldn't launch because of weather. I was at the Davis Monthan Boneyard doing contractor work, inventory management, and I walked to that warthog. Tail 7739 Ereco. It still had some systems active, fuel in the tanks, and the maintenance crew had left the armament mostly intact. I didn't think. I just got in and flew." "That's not how vertigo works," Webb said, having followed Kessler. "You shouldn't be able to maintain spatial orientation." Nora's laugh was bitter. "Yeah, well, tell that to my inner ear. I threw up twice during the flight. There were moments I couldn't tell up from down, but I had those Marines and I had the A-10 and somehow," she trailed off. "Somehow the bird knew what to do. Sounds crazy." "Everything about tonight sounds crazy," Kessler said, but he was looking at her differently now. Not as a rule breaker or a security risk. As something else. Something the military tried to train into existence but could never quite manufacture. A person who, when faced with an impossible choice, simply refused to accept the limitations. The ambulances were pulling away, sirens cutting through the night. Nora watched them go, and Kessler saw her lips moving silently. Maybe a prayer, maybe just counting to stay grounded. "You're going to be in a world of trouble," he said quietly. "Stealing military equipment, unauthorized flight operations, violating your medical discharge. I know. Those Marines are alive because of you." She met his eyes then, and he saw they were wet. "One of them isn't. But 2 are, that's not nothing." Nora didn't respond. She was staring at the A-10, which sat quietly on the taxiway like a loyal dog waiting for its master. The smoke from the port engine had stopped. In the floodlights, the aircraft looked ancient and tired, every panel and rivet telling stories of violence survived. Ugly, mean, and undeniably beautiful in its brutal functionality. Kessler made a decision. "Get her to medical," he told the crew chief. "Full examination. I want to know how she's still standing." Then to Nora. "After that, you and I are going to have a very long conversation, but right now go let them check you out." She nodded, let herself be guided toward a waiting ambulance. Before she climbed in, she turned back. "Major, that warthog, don't scrap it again. It saved my life tonight, all our lives." Kessler looked at the aircraft, then back at her. "I'll see what I can do." As the ambulance pulled away, Webb moved beside him. "What are you thinking, sir?" "I'm thinking," Kessler said slowly, "that we just witnessed something the manuals don't cover. And I'm thinking those 2 Marines in the hospital are going to tell a story that's going to spread through the ranks like wildfire. The grounded pilot who stole a warthog to save lives. It's going to be a problem. Or, Webb said, it's going to be a reminder of why we do this in the first place. They stood in silence, watching the A-10. Somewhere in the distance, Dawn was thinking about braking. The night had been long, strange, and impossible, but the sun would rise anyway, the way it always did, indifferent to the small dramas of those who lived and died beneath it. Inside the base hospital, Nora sat on an examination table while a doctor shined lights in her eyes and asked her to track his finger. She failed every coordination test. Her vestibular system was, medically speaking, a disaster. Yet she'd flown an A-10 through contested airspace, executed a successful extraction under fire, and landed safely. The doctor, a captain named Morrison who'd been in the service long enough to know when to stop asking questions, simply made notes and shook his head. "You should be unconscious from vertigo," he said. "What you did tonight should be physiologically impossible." "Yeah," Nora replied, her voice distant. "Add it to the list." Morrison gave her something for the nausea, something else for the pain, and told her to rest. But rest wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the Hindu Kush 3 years ago, watching her wingman's A-10 disintegrate under enemy fire. She'd been flying close support for a ground unit when the anti-aircraft fire had opened up. Her wingman, a young pilot named Lieutenant Ramos, had taken the first hit. Nora had watched him eject, watched the parachute deploy, and then watched helplessly as ground forces moved in before the rescue birds could arrive. She'd expended every round in her cannon trying to keep them back, had flown so low she'd scraped the warthog's belly on a ridgeline, but it hadn't been enough. Ramos had died before help arrived, and Nora had developed such severe psychological trauma that it manifested as physical vertigo. The mind, the flight surgeon had told her, has ways of protecting itself. Sometimes it grounds you whether you want to be grounded or not. But tonight, when she'd heard those Marines calling for help, something had overridden all of that. The vertigo, the fear, the regulations. She'd simply acted. Now sitting in the hospital room as dawn light began to filter through the windows, she wondered what came next. Court-martial, probably. Dishonorable discharge. Maybe prison time. But those 2 Marines were alive. That had to count for something. A knock on the door. Kessler entered, looking tired but alert. He pulled up a chair and sat without asking permission. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, 2 people trying to figure out how to talk about something that defied explanation. "The Marines are stable," he said finally. "One's in surgery, but the doctors are optimistic. The other one is already asking about you. Says you pulled him from a burning vehicle while taking fire. Says you're the most terrifying pilot he's ever seen." Nora managed a small smile. Terrifying, that's not usually a compliment. "In this context, I think it is." Kessler leaned forward. "I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. How did you even know about the situation?" So she told him. About working the late shift at the boneyard, sorting through decommissioned aircraft. About the radio she kept on her desk, tuned to military frequencies out of habit, out of the inability to fully let go of who she'd been. About hearing the distress calls from a Marine patrol that had stumbled into an ambush during a training exercise gone wrong. About the desperate calls for close air support, and the responses from base saying weather had grounded everything. That help was minimum 40 minutes away. "I didn't plan it," she said. "I walked to that A-10 thinking I'd just sit in the cockpit for a minute, just remember what it felt like. But the keys were in the ignition. Literally, someone had left the engine startup keys attached to the panel, and there was fuel, and the gun still had rounds, and I turned the engines over. The warthog started up like she'd been waiting for someone to wake her up. And once she was running, once I felt that vibration through the stick, I couldn't stop myself." "You taxied a decommissioned aircraft off a restricted boneyard and took off without clearance," Kessler said. "It wasn't quite a question. The fences at Davis-Monthan aren't what they used to be, budget cuts, and it was 3 in the morning. Nobody was paying attention to the graveyard section. She paused. I'm not making excuses. What I did was illegal on about 40 different levels, but those Marines didn't have 40 minutes. So you flew to their position, in the dark, with no support, and with a medical condition that should have had you unconscious. The warthog has always been kind to me, Nora said softly. She talks to me. Through the stick, the rudders, the throttle. I couldn't trust my eyes or my inner ear, but I could trust my hands. Does that make sense? It didn't, not medically, not logically. But Kessler had flown combat missions himself, early in his career. He remembered the way a good aircraft became an extension of yourself, how you could feel its moods and capabilities through nothing but vibration and sound. There was something between pilot and machine that transcended instrumentation, something the manuals never captured. "Walk me through the extraction," he said. Nora's voice went flat, clinical, the tone of someone reporting rather than remembering. She described finding the Marines pinned down in a ravine, their vehicles disabled by RPG fire. Described making her approach run through a canyon so narrow her wingtips nearly scraped stone. Described the BRRRT of the GAU-8 as she shredded enemy positions, buying the Marines seconds to move. Described landing the A-10 on a dirt road, the aircraft never designed for such short, rough landings but making it anyway because that's what warthogs did. They survived. They adapted. They brought their people home. There were 4 Marines, she said. Sergeant Chen was furthest from the aircraft. He'd taken shrapnel, was bleeding badly. The other 3 helped me load the 2 worst wounded into the gun bay. That's not a passenger space, Major, but the A-10's belly is big enough if you're desperate. Chen refused evacuation, said he'd cover our takeoff. I argued. He pulled rank. Her voice cracked slightly. He was still firing when I cleared the ridgeline. I circled back, but the position was overrun. I couldn't. There was nothing I could do. Kessler absorbed this. 4 Marines pinned down, 3 extracted, 1 KIA. Under normal circumstances, that would be considered a success. But he knew how these things worked. The ones you saved never weighed quite as much as the ones you didn't. Graves, he said quietly. Nora, you gave 3 men a chance to see tomorrow. That's not nothing. I know, she whispered, but try telling that to Chen's family. They sat in silence. Outside, Fort Bragg was waking up. Personnel moving to morning formations, vehicles starting, the ordinary machinery of military life grinding into motion. But in this room, 2 people existed in the strange space between crisis and consequence, where the impossible thing had been done and now had to be explained. Finally, Kessler stood. I'm going to make some calls. The Marines you saved, they're going to be interviewed. Their testimony matters. And that warthog, I'm going to have it secured and examined. If what you're saying is true, if a decommissioned aircraft can be flight-ready, we've got bigger problems than one unauthorized mission. What happens to me? Nora asked. He looked at her, this woman who'd broken every rule to do the right thing. Honestly, I don't know, but I'm going to make sure that when the story gets told, it gets told right. The whole thing, not just the violations. After he left, Nora lay back on the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. Her body ached. Her head spun. But somewhere beneath the pain and exhaustion was something she hadn't felt in 3 years: purpose. For one night she'd been Ironside again. She'd been the pilot who didn't quit, who brought people home. And even if it cost her everything, even if she never flew again, she'd proven something to herself. She wasn't broken, just grounded. And those were 2 very different things. The sun continued its rise over Fort Bragg, indifferent and eternal. Inside the operations center, Webb was pulling together reports, trying to construct a timeline that made sense. Outside on the taxiway, maintenance crews were swarming over tail 7739 Areco, cataloging damage, checking systems, trying to understand how a 3-year-old aircraft, stripped for parts and abandoned, had performed like it was fresh off the assembly line. And in a hospital room, Nora Graves slept fitfully, dreaming of the sky. By noon, word had spread through the base. The unofficial stories always moved faster than the official ones. The grounded pilot who stole a warthog, the impossible rescue mission, the woman who flew through vertigo and enemy fire to bring Marines home. Details got embellished, as they always did. Some versions had her taking out a dozen enemy positions. Others had her landing under direct fire with the aircraft in flames. The truth was dramatic enough, but truth rarely satisfied the need for myth. The two rescued Marines, once stable enough to talk, told their version. Lance Corporal Justin Park, 22 years old with a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, described Nora as the most stone-cold badass I've ever seen. Private First Class Miguel Torres, 19, still groggy from surgery, called her an angel in a titanium bathtub. Their testimony was consistent. They'd been out of time, out of options, convinced they were going to die in that ravine when they heard the sound. That distinctive brrrrt that announced the A-10's arrival like the voice of an angry god. They'd seen the aircraft come screaming through the canyon, impossibly low, guns blazing. They'd watched it land on a road that seemed too short, too rough. And they'd seen a pilot emerge, moving fast despite obvious physical distress, shouting instructions, helping them load their wounded friend into a space never meant for passengers. She threw up twice while we were loading, Park said. Just turned her head, puked, wiped her mouth, and kept working. Never stopped moving. Got us in, got the bird back in the air, and flew us out while taking fire from both sides of the canyon. I don't know how she held it together. Neither did the doctors. Neither did Kessler. But the story was taking shape, and it was the kind of story that transcended regulations. The kind that reminded people why they joined the service in the first place. By late afternoon, Kessler had made his calls to the base commander, to the Judge Advocate General's office, to the Air Force Chief of Staff. He'd laid out the situation as clearly as he could: unauthorized flight, stolen equipment, medical discharge violations. But also, 3 lives saved, enemy engagement successful, 0 collateral damage. He argued for context, for consideration of intent. He reminded them that the military had a long history of people breaking rules when lives hung in the balance, and that those people were usually either court-martialed or decorated, with very little middle ground. The response was predictable bureaucratic uncertainty. Investigations would need to be conducted, reports filed, decisions made at levels above his pay grade. But he'd planted seeds, and that was something. In the hospital, Nora woke to find a visitor. A young man in Marine fatigues, his arm in a sling, standing awkwardly by her bed. Lance Corporal Park. He looked uncomfortable but determined. "Ma'am," he said, I needed to thank you for what you did." Nora sat up slowly, managing the vertigo. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing what any pilot would do." "No, ma'am," Park said firmly. "Any pilot would have followed orders and stayed grounded. You're something different." She didn't know how to respond to that. Park shifted his weight, clearly working up to something. "Sergeant Chen," he said finally, before the end, he told me something. He said if we made it out, if someone actually pulled off the rescue, we should make sure they knew he went out fighting, that he bought us the time we needed. He wasn't scared, just determined." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. "He was brave, braver than I was." "I don't think that's true, ma'am, but I think he'd like knowing you thought so." After Park left, Nora sat alone with her thoughts. The room felt too small, too quiet. She wanted to be in the sky, where things made sense, where the physics were clean and the rules were absolute. Up there, you either flew or you fell. No ambiguity. No moral gray areas, just lift, thrust, drag, and gravity. A nurse came in, checked her vitals, made disapproving sounds about her blood pressure. "You need rest," the nurse said. "Real rest. Your body has been through trauma." "Story of my life," Nora muttered, but she lay back down. The nurse was right. Her body was a mess, but her mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. The vertigo was still there, spinning the room whenever she moved too quickly, but it felt different now, not like a prison, like a challenge. Evening came. Kessler returned, bringing food from the commissary. They ate in comfortable silence, two professionals who'd seen enough strange things to accept one more impossibility. Finally, Kessler set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what happens next. The official investigation is going to take weeks. In the meantime, you're technically under observation, both medical and, let's call it administrative. But I've been talking to some people, off the record." "About what?" "About the possibility that what you did last night wasn't just a one-time miracle. About whether there might be a way forward, for you, for pilots like you." Nora frowned. "I'm medically disqualified, that doesn't just go away." "Maybe not, but you flew last night, successfully, under conditions that would challenge any pilot. You had vertigo, limited instruments, and hostile fire, and you still executed a perfect extraction and landing. That suggests your condition might be manageable, under certain circumstances." "You're saying I could fly again?" Kessler held up a hand. "I'm saying it's worth exploring. No promises. But if we can understand what happened last night, if we can document it, study it, maybe we can help other pilots who have been grounded for similar reasons. Maybe there's a protocol we haven't discovered yet." Hope was a dangerous thing. Nora had learned to live without it, but now it flickered in her chest, small and fragile and terrifying. What would that look like? Testing, evaluation, working with flight surgeons who are willing to think outside the standard medical framework, and probably flying again under controlled conditions to see if you can replicate what you did last night. "And if I can't?" "Then at least we tried, and you still saved 3 lives, that's not nothing." She thought about it, about the risk of hopping, of trying and failing, about what it would mean to get back in a cockpit and discover that last night had been a fluke, a one-time miracle born of adrenaline and desperation. But she thought too about the feeling of the stick in her hand, the warthog responding to her commands, the way everything else had fallen away except the mission. That clarity, that purpose. "Okay," she said, "let's see what's possible." Kessler smiled. "Good, because I already started making calls." Over the following days, Fort Bragg became a strange intersection of bureaucracy and curiosity. The official investigation proceeded with military precision: interviews, depositions, technical examinations of the A-10. But underneath the official procedures, something else was happening. Word of Nora's flight had spread beyond the base. Other grounded pilots heard the story and reached out, asking questions, sharing their own experiences. Flight surgeons who specialized in vestibular disorders contacted Kessler, intrigued by the case. And slowly, carefully, a coalition began to form around the idea that maybe, just maybe, the military's approach to certain medical disqualifications was too rigid. Nora became the reluctant center of this attention. She gave interviews, participated in medical tests, spent hours in simulators while doctors monitored her responses. The vertigo was real, documented, severe. By every standard metric, she shouldn't be able to maintain spatial orientation in flight. But when she was in the simulator, when she had a stick in her hand and a mission to complete, something shifted. She could compensate, adapt, use instruments and muscle memory and pure determination to fly when her body said she couldn't. "It's like she's overriding her own biology," one of the flight surgeons marveled. "The vertigo is still there, but she's developed coping mechanisms that are, well, unprecedented." Not everyone was convinced. There were skeptics who argued that one successful flight didn't establish a pattern, that Nora had gotten lucky, that allowing her back in the air would set a dangerous precedent. The regulations existed for a reason, they said. Medical standards protected pilots and the people around them. But the Marines she'd saved were vocal advocates. Park and Tours gave interviews, told their story repeatedly, made it clear that Nora hadn't gotten lucky. She'd been skilled, controlled, and focused under impossible conditions. Their testimony carried weight. Weeks passed. The investigation concluded with a recommendation for non-judicial punishment, a formal reprimand for unauthorized use of military equipment, balanced against recognition of her actions saving lives. It was a compromise, neither full condemnation nor full exoneration. Nora accepted it without argument. She'd known there would be consequences. But the more important development was the special evaluation board that Kessler had managed to convene. A panel of flight surgeons, senior pilots and medical researchers tasked with determining whether Nora's case warranted reconsidering her medical disqualification. It was unprecedented. The military didn't typically reverse medical discharges. But then, pilots didn't typically steal A-10s to rescue Marines either. The board met on a cold October morning. Nora sat before them in her dress uniform, the one she'd kept in storage for 3 years. The ribbons on her chest told their own story: Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters. She'd earned the right to be there, whatever they ultimately decided. The board chair, a colonel named Patricia Whitman with 30 years in aviation medicine, spoke first. Captain Graves, we've reviewed your medical history, your recent flight, and the evaluation results from the past month. Before we proceed with questions, I want to be clear about something. We're not here to judge you. We're here to determine if there's a path forward. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Nora replied. Then let's begin. In your own words, describe what happened during your flight. Focus on the physical experience. How did you manage the vertigo? Nora had prepared for this. She'd thought through every moment of that night, trying to understand it herself. Ma'am, the vertigo was constant. Every maneuver, every turn, I felt like I was tumbling. My inner ear was telling me I was upside down when I was level, diving when I was climbing. It was disorienting and nauseating, but I'd trained for spatial disorientation. Every military pilot has. We learned to trust our instruments over our senses. I had to do that constantly, every second of the flight. That level of sustained cognitive override should be exhausting, one of the other board members said. Overwhelming, even for short periods. It was, Nora admitted. But I had a mission. That gave me something to focus on, something more important than the discomfort. They questioned her for 2 hours, about her physical symptoms, her decision-making process, her assessment of risk. They asked about the moments she'd doubted herself and the moments she'd felt confident. They probed for any indication that she'd been reckless, that she'd endangered herself or others through impaired judgment. But her answers were consistent, thoughtful, and honest. She'd been scared. She'd been sick, but she'd been in control. Finally, Colonel Whitman called for a recess. The board would deliberate. Nora was dismissed to wait. She found herself walking across the base, moving without destination. Her feet carried her to the flight line, where aircraft sat in orderly rows. F-16s, C-130s, helicopters. And there, at the end of a taxiway under a maintenance shelter, tail 7739 Areco, the warthog that had carried her through the impossible. It had been cleaned, repaired, and was